you want to get your Bibles and turn to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. We have a lot of ground to cover tonight, so I need you to stick with me as much as you can. We introduced this study last week, and I will be out of town next Wednesday. Jerry will be filling in for me, and I wouldn't sick on anyone the privilege of teaching about the man of lawlessness, so we need to finish it tonight so that Jerry's not burdened with that next week. When you come to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we mentioned this last week, especially when you pick up in verse 3 and read down especially through verse 10, you're dealing with what most agree to be one of the most difficult passages in the New Testament. It's difficult in some ways because I think man has tried to make it difficult. It's difficult on its own by itself without man's help, but I think sometimes man gets into some of these difficult passages and muddies the water and makes it a little more difficult to understand than perhaps it is. When you come to 2 Thessalonians, you're in a book, and as we study this, please keep this passage and this paragraph, please keep it in context. When you come to any passage in the Bible, whether it be easy or difficult or somewhere in the middle, if you'll keep it in its context, you've got a better chance of understanding it. If you take something out of its context, you have a really good chance of misunderstanding it. That's how a lot of false doctrines get started, is when people take passages out of context and don't keep them within the Bible and keep them within the book and keep them within the paragraph in which they're found. So we're coming to a book, we're coming to 2 Thessalonians following 1 Thessalonians. Both of these books have a theme of the second coming. Keep this paragraph within the context of the second coming. Paul's been dealing with that in this book since the middle of the first chapter. When you get to chapter 2 and verse 1, he says, now specifically, I want us to talk about this matter of us being gathered together to Him. Paul's bringing their attention specifically to this matter of the Lord's second coming and of being gathered together to Him. And he says, I don't want you to be soon shaken in mind, verse 2. I don't want you to be troubled. I don't want you to be concerned about things that you're hearing from other people, whether it be in spirit or in word or in deed. I don't want you to be concerned and scared when these other false teachers are coming and saying, well, did you hear what Paul said? Recognize I didn't say that. In verse 5, he says, you know exactly what I told you. Do you not remember what I told you over and over and over while I was there? You've got to remember what I was telling you. And folks, we need to remember that we weren't there. We don't know what Paul told this church when he was present with them. They do. And so when Paul speaks in this part of the chapter in generalities, he doesn't get very specific for us. When he speaks in some generalities, when he talks to them about things that they already knew, they understood perfectly what he was saying. This was not a difficult passage to the church that was receiving it. It's difficult to us because we don't have the privilege of hearing everything that he said before they got this. And so we try to make up in our minds what was it that he told them and then try to apply that. So there's a lot of things about this passage. We've got to admit this up front. There's a lot of things about this passage we don't know. And so it is therefore not possible for us to come to a 100% for certain conclusion exactly what Paul was talking about. We don't have all of the information in this passage. And so for us to leave here tonight, having grabbed a hold of one of the 4 or 5 or maybe it's 6 possibilities that we're going to discuss rapidly of what this passage could be talking about, for us to grab a hold of one of those and say, this is it, this is what this passage means for certain, and to be dogmatic about it and to ram it down other people's throat and say, well, you're wrong if you believe anything else. We don't know that. We can have a pretty good idea, but it's just one of those passages where we don't have all of the information. Let me put a parenthesis here and say this. That is not true about everything in the Bible. We've got to understand that. There are things in the Bible that most of the Bible is very explicit and we can understand everything there is to know about it. When it comes to the matter of our salvation, there's no uncertainty about it. when it comes to the matter of the church and about worship and about the organization of the church, when it comes to doctrinal matters today, there is no fuzziness. There's nothing that's unclear. When you come to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, you're not dealing with some doctrinal matter that's going to affect my eternal salvation. My understanding of 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 through 10, is not going to change whether I go to heaven or not. But I think we can have a pretty good idea. And what I want us to do is the same thing we did last week. I want us to read through this. What I want you to do is take whatever you have been told or thought that this passage meant before, set it aside for the next few minutes, open your minds, recognize the context, read the words, understand the words. We're going to look very quickly at the 12 characteristics that we mentioned last week that this passage says characterize this man of sin or this man of lawlessness, and then talk about some possibilities as to who this one could be. Start with me in verse 3. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day, the day of the second coming, the day of the Lord, will not come unless the falling away comes first. Remember the context. These folks thought that the Lord was going to be coming back that very day, and so they had gone out and they had quit their jobs. They had stopped working. They had become busybodies in other people's matters. They had become lazy bums. When you read 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and you pick up about verses 8 through 12, that's exactly what he's saying. You've got to learn to mind your own business. You need to learn to work with your hands. You need to learn to do the Lord's will. And that's what they were not doing. And so put it in its context, and here were some folks who had quit working. And when we get to chapter 3, we're going to see it even more. He says, understand there is something that must happen. Context of this passage is, when is Jesus going to return? He will not return until something happens. What is that? He says, until the falling away comes first. Jesus will not come until that happens first. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Jesus will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. We're in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, now in verse 4. This man of sin, this man of lawlessness, perhaps a better translation, this son of perdition, is one who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God and all that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I was telling you these things, and now you know what is restraining this man of sin, this man of lawlessness. You know what is restraining him from being revealed, that he may be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, who the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. And for this reason God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Who is this man of lawlessness? What does this passage tell us about him? It tells us at least 12 different characteristics about this man of lawlessness. First of all, the man of sin, the man of lawlessness, is the ultimate result of the falling away. The falling away will happen, and then this man of lawlessness is going to be revealed. From Paul's vantage point in AD 52, this was yet future. From Paul's vantage point, this sinister force, this man of lawlessness, was yet to be revealed. The man of lawlessness, the one who has no regard for the law of God, he is called the son of perdition. Just means the son of destruction. It literally means he's the perishing one. He's the one who has at the end destruction. That's what he's characterized by. Number 4, this man of lawlessness blatantly opposes God and His revealed will. This man of lawlessness arrogantly seeks preeminence by exalting himself against God and all that is genuinely sacred. In some sense, we don't know exactly how, the man of lawlessness will sit in the temple of God, fearlessly proclaiming himself as God. The man of lawlessness, who's willing to be used as Satan's vehicle, deceives those who love not the truth by virtue of the lying wonders which he effects. In fact, the prime objective of the man of lawlessness is to deceive God's children. The early stages of this apostasy in verse 7 were already at work. The mystery of lawlessness is already at work, even in Paul's day. In Paul's day, there was some influence. We don't know exactly who this was, but they did. When you read verse 6, they knew who was restraining. There was some influence whose identity those readers knew that restrained the man of lawlessness so that he may be revealed in his own time. Look in verse 6. Just look in verse 6 and in verse 7 just briefly, just so you recognize this in case we don't point this out. In verse 6 it says, "And now you know what is restraining." When you get down to verse 7, the middle of the verse says, "And only he who now restrains." In verse 6, it's neuter. You know what is restraining. In verse 7, it's masculine. It's he who is restraining. And that's interesting to note the two differences, the difference there. The restraining force eventually would be taken out of the way. He would be taken away from their midst in order that this man of lawlessness might be revealed. After he was revealed, he would endure for some time. He would endure in some form until the end of time. He would endure until Christ came again, and when Christ came at the second coming, he would be destroyed by the word of the Lord and by the presence of the Lord. That's what we know about this man from this passage. If you weren't here last week, we spent a little more time talking about these things. You might want to get the CD. Who is this guy? Or who is this force? I don't have a lot of time to deal with all of this. I would encourage you, if you're interested in any of this, to read some books about it, just to get some different perspectives. I would not encourage you to get on the internet. I know you're going to do it now that I've told you not to do it. But I would not encourage you to get on the internet. You're going to read some whacked out. As with anything, you're going to read some really weird stuff on the internet. And I'm not going to deal with the weird stuff tonight. I don't have time to deal with weird stuff in here. But there's just some weird ideas. And it's interesting, folks who don't even believe in the Bible have an idea of who this is. I don't know why people who don't believe in the inspiration of the Bible, why do they even care? But we're not going to talk about what they believe, because if you don't believe the Bible is inspired by God, you know, I don't have a whole lot of use for what you believe and what you have to say about the Bible. That's not meant to be rude. That's just meant to be truthful. Who is this guy? Some people say that he was a Roman emperor. They either say he was a Roman emperor, or he may represent a line or the line of the Roman emperors. Could that be the man of lawlessness? And think about those 12 characteristics. Do those 12 characteristics, do verses 3 through 12, or 3 through 10 specifically, do they describe perhaps a Roman emperor? Here's why some people would say that he's a Roman emperor. First of all, their support is that Paul wrote in a cryptic and symbolic language. He's kind of mysterious. He's not telling us everything. Maybe he's not telling us everything so that it kind of slides under the government's eyes and they don't know what he's talking about. Maybe that's one plausible explanation for why he doesn't go into details. Many of the Roman emperors laid claims to deity, and they demanded worship. Many of the Roman emperors, particularly when you think about your own studies, you'll think about Nero, you'll think particularly about Domitian, they claimed they didn't just demand worship, they demanded worship because they claimed to be God. Well, does that describe perhaps the man of lawlessness? Here were people demanding people to bow down to them. Particularly from Nero's reign and on, they opposed Christianity by persecuting it. And the restraining one is often identified in this particular theory as another Roman emperor. That there was one Roman emperor who was kind of holding back the forces, and then once that Roman emperor passed on, then the whole Roman Empire unleashed on them, and that was the man of lawlessness. There was one emperor, Caligula, who profaned the temple at Jerusalem by setting up a statue of himself inside the temple. Is it possible that Paul is talking about the Roman Empire as being the man of lawlessness? It's possible. There are some things that I think are against this theory. First of all, Paul couldn't have been talking about Caligula. Paul's writing this in about the year 52 A.D. Caligula's already dead. What he's done has already happened. Paul seems to be talking about something that's yet future, and yet he couldn't be talking about Caligula because that had already happened in the past. The man of sin was to be in existence. He was to be present and active and waging his opposition against God's people when Jesus returns, and at that point Jesus would destroy him. If the man of sin is either the Roman Empire or the line of Roman emperors or a particular Roman emperor himself, I don't think it fits here, because how is it that Jesus is going to destroy him by His very presence when the Roman Empire doesn't exist anymore? It's already faded into the pages of history. It's already been destroyed. How is He going to destroy it when it's not even here to be destroyed? I think this is a valid theory. I think it's possible. I think there are some things that are against it that weigh heavily and say it may not be the best theory. If you want to hold to it, go right ahead. I won't think any less of you. If you pick up some of those whacked out theories on the internet now, I'll have some concern about you. Some people think that it was Judaism. That Judaism was the man of lawlessness. That Judaism was this one who was opposing and exalting itself above God. And particularly, there are some who would argue here that specifically perhaps it was those Judaizing teachers that Paul and John and the apostles had to deal with so much. And truly they were in opposition to Christianity. We will grant them that. And so there is some things that may support this idea. There are those who espouse, and I don't know how many of you have heard about this doctrine of realized eschatology. Basically, those are two huge words that are difficult to sign that basically talk about there are some folks even today, some folks even in the church today, who believe that everything you read in the New Testament, all New Testament prophecies, even New Testament prophecies about the second coming of Christ, were all fulfilled in A.D. 70 when the city of Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed. So they read passages like some of the ones we read in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, where it talks about Jesus returning. They take those and they apply them and say they were fulfilled in A.D. 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed. Now there is a sense, and we have no time to talk about this, there is a sense when you read Matthew 24, up until verse 34 of Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and Jesus says, I think it's about verse 28, it's got to be verse 29 or 30, where Jesus says that He would be there. He would come in the destruction of Jerusalem. So there is a sense in which Jesus did come in the destruction of Jerusalem, but there are these folks who believe in this AD 70 doctrine that say every prophecy in the New Testament about the future, about the coming of Jesus, was all fulfilled in AD 70. And that comes into play under this theory of Judaism. They argue that the man of sin was a part of Judaism, particularly a hardened militant Jew of the Zealot sect, and he was destroyed by the coming of the Lord and destruction of Jerusalem. When Jerusalem's destroyed, when the temple is destroyed, then in effect at that point, in a tangible sense, Judaism was destroyed. Records are destroyed. And so maybe that's the man of lawlessness at that point. Even some who don't hold to that particular doctrine still argue that the man of lawlessness was a Judaizing teacher, because they were ones who opposed what Christianity was about. They were ones who opposed Christ's doctrine. And so they may argue that he was a Judaizing teacher. There are some things that would be against this particular thing. I don't think that Judaism can be recognized as the falling away. When you read verse 3, Paul says, the second coming, I'm sorry I'm going so fast, but I don't have a choice. So in verse 3, Paul says the second coming cannot take place unless the falling away come first. Judaism is something that was already in existence before Christianity ever came. And it's hard for me to see, it is true, especially when you read the Hebrew letter and the Galatian letter, It is true that if a Christian left Christianity to go to Judaism, they were falling away. But I don't see how something that was already in existence prior to the time of Christianity could be described as the falling away, especially when it was, Hebrews 8 verse 13, fading away. And so something that was in the past seems to be difficult for that to be that which is yet future. Paul's prophecy of the second coming was not fulfilled in AD 70, as is evidenced by the fact that Christians were not gathered unto the Lord in connection with Jerusalem's fall. Those that believe all of those prophecies are aimed towards the destruction of Jerusalem, show me where Christians were gathered up together, as we look at in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 1. How were they gathered up together? There's a lot of verses that don't fit their theory, and they have a hard time explaining around, but they do it. Third theory. Was it the devil? When you read through this passage, does it sound like the work of the devil? Yeah. If you want to believe it's Judaism, by the way, I didn't say it, but if you want to believe it's Judaism, you can do that. But what about the devil? Is the devil interested in the falling away? Is the devil interested in opposing God, exalting himself above God, sitting in the temple of God? Is he interested in leading Christians astray and getting them to believe the lie? Yeah, he's interested in those things. The term Satan means adversary. Verse 4 says that he would oppose. It means the same thing. The devil was working behind the scenes during Paul's ministry, and hence when he talks about the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, maybe he's talking about Satan working behind the scenes. What Paul reveals about the son of perdition corresponds with other descriptions of Satan in other New Testament passages. It is argued that the Holy Spirit was the one who was restraining him. Some believe that Satan may become incarnate before the end of the world, before the end of time, and he'll gather his workers together for a great battle against the Lord. And it is true that Christ is going to destroy Satan and his work at his coming. So is it possible that this could be talking about the devil himself? I only have one thing that's against this, but I don't know how you get around verse 9, where it says that the man of lawlessness is coming in accordance with the working of Satan. And Paul seems to distinguish between Satan personally and the man of lawlessness. The man of lawlessness is coming according to the working of Satan. He seems to separate the two. Could it be Satan? It sounds a lot like Satan. It's possible that it could be, but there's some other things we could say maybe in opposition to this particular theory, but I don't know how you get around verse 9. If you want to believe it's the devil, that's okay, because in reality, this was in the working of Satan, and so the man of lawlessness was working in cohorts with the devil. While we might not know who the man of lawlessness was, we do know who was behind it. It was, verse 9, in accordance with the working of Satan. Another theory is that this guy was an eschatological figure, meaning he's a guy that's still yet to come. Eschatology just means the study of last things, a study of final things. And so there are those who believe that this guy is still yet future even from us. Didn't exist in Paul's day, didn't exist in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th. Hasn't existed yet, and he's still yet to come. And so here's what they say. There are those who believe in premillennialism, and they contend that the man of sin is an individual embodying anti-God power who is still to arise future from us, but before the day of the Lord. Some call this hostile person, the person who says this is Hal Lindsey, maybe you've heard of him. They call him the future Führer and contend that things are happening in the world today, setting the stage for him to make an entrance. Do you hear people talking about, well, there's a lot of stuff happening today. Maybe what they say, and we'll talk about this in a minute, what they say is the Antichrist is probably coming at any point. I've heard more about the Antichrist in the last 2 months than I've heard in the last 2 years on the radio. When this 666, did y'all hear about June 6, 06, and there was this big upset about having your baby born on June 6, 06, and boy, it might be the Antichrist. There were radio programs leading up to that day. Oh no, there's ladies who are scheduling C-sections so they don't have a child in 6606. Give me a break. Anyway, there are people who are interpreting whatever signs they see happening. They say, oh, well, things are about ready to happen. We'll say something about that in a minute. They argue that He will appear just before the Lord comes back again. Let me say a few things against this. In verse 7, the mystery of lawlessness was already at work in Paul's day. And to take that and say, oh, well, the man of lawlessness really isn't going to appear for another 2,000 years, makes that stretch a little bit longer than it seems Paul was allowing that to stretch. How can we know such a figure would be just about to come, as people say, when we cannot know the times and the seasons of His coming or the things leading up to it? In previous classes, we've talked about this. In Matthew 24 and Mark 16 and Luke 21, boy, we got to move. Jesus gave some signs of something that was going to happen. But all of the signs that you read there are about the destruction of Jerusalem. Every single sign you read is about the coming of the destruction of the Jerusalem. When you get beyond verse 34 of Matthew 24, you get to verse 36, and Jesus says, but of that day and hour, talking about the second coming, no one knows. Wait a minute. But of that day and hour, no one knows. If He just gave a list of signs, then somebody ought to know when it's coming. They knew when the destruction of Jerusalem was coming because they could interpret the signs. But there are no signs given about the second coming except the one mentioned in verse 3 here, that the falling away had to come first. So when you look at this, there's no way that we could say, oh, well, the Antichrist is about ready to come. First of all, it's a misinterpretation of the passage, and maybe we'll have time to talk about that. Second of all, there are no signs for us to be interpreting. The Lord hasn't given us any. This evil was to begin in the apostles' days and to continue in the world until the second coming of Christ. Thus, it necessarily follows that this could not be carried on by one man, but perhaps by men in every age. Sorry, I got a typo in there. This was to begin in the apostles' days. Just put that in your mind, if you would. Could it be that this is talking about some eschatological figure? No. If you believe this one, then we need to have some more study, because there is no biblical evidence that there's anyone that's going to match that particular theory. This is perhaps this is probably the most widely held belief, that the man of lawlessness was describing and a depiction of Catholicism and the hierarchy that began to develop in Catholicism, and specifically a picture of the line of popes, the papacy line, specifically looking at them as the man of lawlessness. There's more points on this than these others, so I need to get through these quickly. But here's the argumentation that is made to say this. The argument is made that the popes have left no wickedness unpracticed. And the titles they wear, like the Vicar of Christ and our Lord God the Pope, that's what they call the Pope. And the authority that they pretend over all temporal rulers too, make this idea attractive. Have you ever heard the Pope called the Vicar of Christ? Do you know what that means? Say again, Mike. Christ on earth. You know what the word vicarious means? I mean, it's the same deal. They just leave off the IOUS. What does vicarious mean? If someone, we sometimes talk about the vicarious sacrifice of Jesus. What did He do? He suffered in place of another. And so if the Pope is the Vicar of Christ, what is he? He's in the place of Christ. He has the authority of Christ. The falling away germinated from within the church. You can't fall away from something that you haven't been in. We don't have time to deal with that. But the position of the Pope claims all religious authority and infallibility. The church, the Catholic Church that is, makes claims of miracles being performed by recognized saints. You cannot be sainted if you haven't performed at least 4, but ideally 6 miracles. The Pope or papal system exalts itself against God and Jesus affirming the position as the infallible substitute of Jesus. Whatever the Pope says goes. He is in the place of Christ on this earth. The Pope doeth whatsoever he listeth, even things unlawful, and is more than God. According to Roman Catholicism, tradition, that is the voice of the church, is superior to the Scriptures. The papal system sits in the temple of God or claims to have supreme authority in the church. I skipped number 9. The Pope claims that whereas Christ is the head of the church in heaven, the papacy is the head of the church on earth. I wish we had time to talk about these individually. We just got to rush. The papacy usurps the place of God by making claims that belong only to deity. If the Pope is called our Lord God the Pope, another God upon the earth, King of kings and Lord of lords, is that deity? And he's claiming to be deity. The Pope accepts adoration that is not proper for man to accept. Men bow before papal dignitary, kiss his feet, his ring, etc. The Pope presumes to act for God in matters pertaining exclusively to deity, offering people the forgiveness of sins. The papal system lawlessly attempts to act in place of God. The restraining power was the Roman government. And when it fell, the Roman bishop and Pope seized power, maintaining it to this day. At least that's what's claimed, is what was restraining it was the government. Numerous church fathers believed this. It is a matter of history that when imperial Rome fell in 476, a great power was shifted into the hands of church clerics. And after Rome fell, this church of the day accelerated in power. Great political authority was gained by the church. Crowns of the kings were removed and bestowed at the behest of the papal rulers. And the Protestant Reformation leaders like Martin Luther and Wycliffe and others held this position, as well as many, many others. I wish we had time to deal with this adequately. Again, this is probably the most widely held view in the church. It's widely held out of the church. There are those in the Protestant denominations that also claim this. If you read different Protestant commentaries, they will make these arguments as well. If you want to believe this, I think it's okay. I don't know that this is the case, though. First of all, there's 12 valid points that we've presented. Is it 12? Yeah. 12 valid points and subpoints that say this could fit. When you look at the characteristics of the man of lawlessness, it could fit here. There's a lot of things that match. We don't have time to deal with each of these. Let me show you just a few things that perhaps don't fit. Papacy limits its claim of infallibility to specific areas. Number 2, when you read 1 John chapter 2 and verse 18, it says that there are many antichrists. You might open your Bibles there. We'll look at it in just a minute if we have time. But Paul says, you know that Antichrist is coming, and if you have the word the in 1 John 2 and verse 18 before the Antichrist, the word the is not in the original Greek. Translators have put it in there. There is no such thing as the Antichrist. The Bible doesn't use the article there. The Bible just says, you know Antichrist is coming. But he goes on to say, many Antichrists have already come. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 8 says that there were many of these antichrists, and so the application perhaps could be broader than just one man or one false system. Here's what I want you to see about this particular theory. If you want to hold this theory, I think probably most of you in here who had any idea before we started talking held this theory, so I don't want to say anything that's going to crush you. But ultimately, here's where I have a problem with this theory. This passage could have had no meaning or application for over 500 years. Think about that. Paul says this, and what that means is Jesus could not have returned for 500 years until Catholicism was in place. The second coming of Christ would be forced 500 years into the future, could not have come a day earlier. The following passages would have no force at all, no meaning, no direct application at all if you have to wait 500 years. Please write these down and look at them. The first 3 are in the same context. First 3 from Matthew 24 and Mark 16 and Luke 21. They're all from the same context. It's after Jesus has dealt with the matter of the destruction of Jerusalem. He then goes on to talk about the second coming. And he warns the apostles Read those passages carefully. He warns the apostles in these passages. He warns them about the second coming. And he warns them that it could come upon you. Underline the word you when you read those passages. Is it possible that the second coming could have come upon them? When he tells the apostles, he says, "Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour when he comes." Why would they have to care if he really couldn't come for another 500 years? And if he couldn't come for another 500 years, these passages, not just the context we're looking at, these passages have no meaning. And not a single preacher for the first 500 years of the church could ever say, the Lord could come tonight. He couldn't say that. Could not say that. Because, oh, wait a minute, we got to wait for Catholicism to get into place. There's a lot more we can discuss there. That is very black and white. That's very cut and dry. There's some things we could discuss in there. We don't have time. I've got to move on. Here's one theory I think you ought to consider. Not because it's my opinion, because tomorrow I might change my opinion. Because with this passage, you have a right to do that. Is it possible that this is not talking about Catholicism? David, you've got to stretch this bell as long as you can. Is it possible that this is not talking about one sect of false doctrine or false religion? Is it possible that it's not just narrowing in on one, but that it's broader than that? And that it's looking at the principle of evil that would be inherent in any and all false religion and false doctrine. Think about these things. The presence of the man of sin satisfies a multiplicity of possibilities, especially since we don't know all the details, including any religious movement, institution, or system or historical character, and perhaps that is being personified in the man of lawlessness. Paul was possibly portraying the perpetual conflict of good and evil and the final outcome of this struggle when the Lord returned and destroyed the man of lawlessness. The man of lawlessness seems to be identical with Antichrist in 1 John 2 and verse 18. And please just read that when you have time. Read the whole passage, the whole context of 1 John 2 to see that. John 2 is personifying evil, especially the evil that operated in false teachers who denied Christ having come in the flesh, but that John has no one single person in mind from his use is obvious because he says many antichrists. John wasn't talking about one antichrist. When you talk to people who say that, take them to the passage, read it with them, see that there's more than one talked about. It may be that no specific power or person is in view in 2 Thessalonians 2. Paul has personified perhaps a principle or idea of evil which may appear in various forms in different historical periods as an opponent of truth. Paul says that Christ will come and destroy the man of sin with the brightness of His coming. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 15 and verse 13? He said, every plant that God has not planted is going to be uprooted. When's that going to happen? Is that similar wording to what Paul used? Principle of evil personified in any, sorry about this misplaced parentheses, principle of evil personified in any and all religious error was already at work. If it's just Catholicism, think about what was already happening. Was the church dealing with idolatry, with worship of angels, with the deceitful handling of the Word, with strife and division, with human traditions, with men seeking preeminence? You read 3 John, here's somebody already claiming to be God. He's already seeking preeminence. There were some of these things already at work. So what's the restraining force? If it's true that it's just any and all religious error, and it's just a principle of evil that's personifying that, what's restraining it? Is it possible that God was holding this back from its full force? Is it possible that the apostles were holding this back from its full force? Why was Paul continually going about strengthening the churches? Why was Paul continually writing letters to correct error? Why was he doing that? Was he perhaps the restraining force that was trying to allow the gospel to be preached to every creature under heaven, which it was, Colossians 1? Was he trying to hold back that force of lawlessness long enough for the gospel to get out there first? I think that's possible, in order that the whole counsel of God might be delivered. I think this particular view allows any student of the Bible to come to a similar conclusion. Unless you have help Meaning, unless you have somebody telling you that it was the Pope or Catholicism, you read through the Bible on your own, you're not going to get that. I mean, unless you're just thinking outside the box, you're not going to get that from just reading through it. You're not going to get some of these theories just by, you've got to have somebody tell, you might think it's the devil, you might think it's a Roman emperor just by reading through it from thoughts, but you're not going to come and think, boy, I wonder if it was Catholicism that came along 600 years later that he's talking about. I think you've got to have somebody to tell you that. That doesn't mean it's not Catholicism. Very well could be. But this seems to fit with other passages that talk about apostasy. And we don't have time to look at all of these. But these passages say, David, go ahead and ring the bell. They're out there anyway. These passages also talk about the matter that there were going to be those who would give in to false doctrine. They would have itching ears. When was that going to happen? Think about 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 3. The Lord was not going to come until the falling away came first. The falling away was going to be accompanied by the man of lawlessness. Whether that be a man or a group of men or a principle of evil, there was something that was going to cause the falling away. Not just a falling away, that was already happening. There were people already falling away from the church. It's not that that was being held, but it was the falling away. Something was going, this restraining force was going to be removed, perhaps it was the apostles once they died, and all of this was going to be unleashed. Man of lawlessness was going to be set on a course only to be stopped when Jesus returned and destroyed him. Perhaps when Jesus came and plucked that plan up that he hadn't planted and threw it into the fire. I don't know what this passage is talking about. Here's 6 or 7 theories. Pick one, except for that eschatological figure. Don't believe that one. Don't believe that goofy stuff you're going to find on the internet. Take any of the rest of these, study them, but recognize Deuteronomy 29, verse 29, and we said this last week, says the secret things belong unto the Lord. Folks, I don't think this is for us to know for certain. But what has been revealed has been given to us. What we know for certain we're responsible for. Those things that are secret, if we spend too much time trying to figure them out, we're not going to be pleasing to God and we're going to confuse ourselves even more. If you have any questions about this, I'm sure there's a lot of crossed eyes here, but if you have any questions, if you want some recommendations on materials to read, I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards.